Brothers and sisters, we have the privilege today of having Joel Tay from Creation Ministries International to join us. Creation Ministries International is one of my very favorite ministries that studies creation and the science of creation, and I absolutely have loved them and benefited from them for many years. This has been a long time coming, and I was given a list of possible messages to bring to our church body, and the one that I chose for you was on racism. And it's interesting, if you got to see this last week, many of you were praying for me. I was in Georgia testifying before the Georgia legislature. I'm not sure if how many of you guys have seen that? Okay. So at my testimony, one question was brought up regarding Judaism and the Jewish faith, and then afterwards, one of the other leftist pro-abort legislators said to me, and you got to see it to believe it. She said, "Do you identify as black or African American?" Now, I promised my legislator that I would be nice. And so I said, "No, I think it's pretty obvious. I share a different count of melanin." And she said, "Okay. Now, in hindsight, what do you think I wanted to say?" I wanted to say, "Actually, for the purposes of your question, I identify as a black man, and my pronouns are black man who is right." That's what I would like to say. Now, here's the thing. We recognize the stupidity of that and just the deep-seated animosity and racism, ethnic hatred, ethnic dominance that we see out there in that kind of world. The reason I chose this I've chosen this message for us to be brought to us by Joel is it's not something that's simply out there. It's not something you're going to deal with simply at the legislature with an unbeliever. Unfortunately, we've seen over the last year, there is something that's creeping into the church. This is vitally important. And unfortunately, creeping into the Reformed church. And that is an ethnic dominance, ethnic animus, and hatred for others. You see people who profess to be Reformed Baptists glorying in their whiteness or glorying in their own ethnicity and just demonstrating an animus and hatred for our fellow human beings. And so that's why I specifically chose this message from Joel. So we're grateful to have him. Joel Tay is a scientist and apologist for Creation Ministries International with degrees in systematic theology, evolutionary biology, genetics, and biotechnology. Joel has spent several years with Open Air Street Evangelism Ministries and local churches in Australia and Singapore before joining CMI full-time. The questions he received during this time only reinforce the need for Christians to be equipped with biblically sound, creation-based answers to not only protect their families, but to reach the lost. Brother Joel, thank you. It's an honor to have you today.
Good evening, church. Can you hear me at the back? Can you see me? Thanks for having me here today. It's an honor to be here with you. As you know by now, I work for Creation Ministries International. So we are an international ministry. We exist in 7 countries around the world. And I work for the U.S. office, which is based in Georgia. So I was just watching his video posted on my Facebook the other day of your time in Georgia. Creation Ministries, I sound different from most of you. That's because I'm from Singapore. And we have a website called creation.com. And there's something interesting. When I first joined the ministry, Gary Bates, who I believe was here many years ago, he asked me to speak on racism. You wonder why, right? But a little bit of my background. So I did my science degrees when I was in Australia. I was there for 4 years in Brisbane. And when I was there, I was actively involved with an open-air street preaching ministry. And every Saturday from 9 p.m. to midnight, I would try to share the gospel with people. And I remember one day I had a really strange encounter. Well, sometimes I do speak to white supremacists. That's normal to me. But on this particular occasion, I met a Chinese supremacist. And by the way, let me just say that in this talk, when I say races, I just mean people groups. Okay, so different people groups. And I also want to prepare you that in this talk, I'll be quoting a lot of evolutionists. And a lot of the statements are going to be very racist. But I need you to understand that this is what they are teaching. Okay, so back to the story of where I was trying to share the gospel. And here you have what you would call a white guy. And he was arguing with me. Why did I say it's strange? Because he was insisting that the Chinese is superior to him. And that's very strange because here I am, I'm saying, no, I'm equal to you. And he's saying, no, I'm superior to him. And so that was the strangest argument I ever had. So where did he get the idea that the Chinese is more superior? Well, we'll get to that later on. But in this talk, I'm going to talk about what evolutionists teach. And you're going to see why this whole idea of evolution is so central to the idea of racism. You're going to take you through history from Darwin all the way to this present day. And you're going to notice something. Every 20 or 30 years or so, the evolutionary model changes. Everyone that they say was our ancestor, our ape man ancestor, every single one of those candidates gets thrown out the window and a whole new set takes its place. Yet every time they say, you Christians, you do not know what you're talking about. So if I say evolution, what is the image that comes to most people's mind? Well, many people, you have this idea of what we will call the ape parade. So on one side, you have an ape-like creature, on the other side, you have the human, and then in between, you have all these missing links slowly walking up, right? Where do we get that image from? Well, when we wrote an article about that at Creation Ministries, we say, hey, if you look at that ape parade image, why is it that the guys in the middle, they're all dark-skinned? And people wrote in, they complained to us. They say, no, it's not dark skin, we're not being racist. They said, yes, it's dark skin. They said, no, that's just dark fur. Yet if you go to museums around the United States, go to the Smithsonian, you see that they depict all these so-called missing links with dark skin. Why? Well, let me take you back into history. Who here has heard of human zoos? Anybody? Some of you? Very few, right? So what are human zoos? They sound exactly like what they sound like. So in the early 1900s, major cities around the world, including here in the United States, you have human zoos. And these are places where they place people of different skin color, of different people groups, as displays in the zoos. Why? They are trying to teach the public of the different stages of human evolution. You see, if evolution is true, and different people groups are separated, isolated for hundreds of thousands of years, that means that some people groups are going to be more evolved than other people groups. So by looking at these people groups in this zoo, you can tell people, this is what they're saying, you can show people the different stages of human evolution. Of course, they always say the highest is a white man, and the lowest, of course, you have the gorilla and things like that, and all the other races are in between. And one of the guys that was really well known in this zoo is Ota Benga. So who's Ota Benga? Well, he is what we call a pygmy because he's short. He's from Congo. But I'm not very tall myself, as you know by now. So if Ota Benga were to stand beside me, he would be here. But they take him and they place him in a zoo exhibit. And they call him a savage. Savage was the name that they were used to call the non-white races. And he was placed in the St. Louis World Fair in 1904. Later on in the Bronx Zoo, 2 years later in New York. But why was he regarded as primitive? Why was he regarded as less than fully human? Well, because he had dark skin and he was very short. And they did that in a way to educate the public about human evolution. And they took Ota Benga, they called him the African pygmy, and they put him in the zoo called the ancient ancestors of man. And guess what was the nickname they gave him? The missing link. Then he was placed in a monkey house together with an orangutan to promote the idea of evolution. And they did this with people from all different races, so-called races or people groups from all around the world. You have an exhibit for the American natives, for those from Africa, from those from Asia, and so on. And Ota Benga, when he was here in the United States, he was actually owned by 4 people. All of them white supremacists, all of them very well-known evolutionists. The first was this guy called Samuel Philip Werner. So he was the explorer that went into Congo and brought him back. And in the diary that he wrote in an account, Samuel Werner was horrified because on the way, on the ship back, the missionaries were having meals together with those from Africa. And he cannot believe that. He said, how can that be? These people are not fully human. The second guy that owned Ota Benga was William McGee, famous evolutionist. And he wrote this book called The Trend of Human Progress. And in this book, he said that each so-called race is a different stage of human evolution. Very racist. The third guy, William Temple Hornaday, well-known evolutionist, the director of the Bronx Zoo. And he described in his writing, Ota Benga, he called him a genuine African pygmy belonging to the sub-race commonly called the dwarfs. A sub-race, not fully human. And finally, the fourth one, Madison Grant, the founder of the Bronx Zoo. He was a leading white supremacist, racist, and he actually wrote Hitler's favorite book, The Passing of a Great Race, or the racial basis for European history. Hitler called that book his Bible. 3 years after Madison Grant wrote the book, Hitler came to power in politics. And later on, we know what happened. In that book, he advocated for a rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit. Does that remind you of something that happened during World War II? What inspired Hitler? Evolutionary theory. And meanwhile, while Ota Benga was in the zoo, guess what? Christian leaders were the ones who stood up to protest against those human zoo. So on one side, you have the evolutionists, on the other side, and the evolutionists were saying, no, evolution proves that one race is superior to the other. You Christians, you do not know anything. And on the other side, you have the Christians who are saying we are all equal. We are all made in the image of God. Back in the early 1900s, did they understand the genetics? No, but they had the Word of God. And later you're going to see that genetics has caught up with the Bible. So here let me quote the New York Times back then. And this New York Times here, they're criticizing the Christians, say that you Christians, you are out of date, you're unscientific, you do not know what you're talking about. And it says this, the pygmies are very low on the human scale. The idea that men are all very much alike except for getting your education out of books is now far out of date. You Christians, you do not know what you're talking about. And if you think that human zoos was something that's only in the early 1900s, well, you are mistaken. The last human zoo was actually in Belgium in 1958. And some of you were already born by then. Another guy that was known in the human zoo is this guy called Abraham Urquhart. So who is he? He's an Inuit. He was converted by Moravian missionaries. And he's described as a very devoted Christian. So he's a Christian. He could speak multiple languages, his native tongue. He could speak German and he could speak English. He could write very well, draw very well. Described as being very hardworking. In fact, he played the violin for his church. And the only reason why we know what he went through was he wrote a diary recording what life was like. He was told, because they owe a lot of money, he was told that he could get paid by helping out in the scientific endeavor. Of course, by that, a scientific experiment turns out to be becoming a zoo exhibit. And he brought his whole family with him, and they all became human exhibit, trying to show the inferior stages of evolutionary progress. Very sad. So here he was imprisoned in that zoo with his family. He was not vaccinated for smallpox. So guess what happened? They all started to catch smallpox. And his entire family, all of them, began to die one by one. And he died too. And just before he died, he wrote this. He said, I do not long for earthly possessions, but this is what I long for, to see my relatives again who are over there, to talk to them of the name of God as long as I live. I am a poor man who's dust. This poor Christian, imagine the guy who's playing a violin or playing the guitar. You take him, you put him in the zoo because it's a different skin color for you. Why? All in the name of evolution. In Australia, it's worse. Australian Aboriginals, they were killed. They had their skulls boiled down, sent overseas to collectors. Why? Because they were regarded as subhuman or non-human. Sounds like a lot of things that we're experiencing today, right? When we talk about abortion and things like that, they say they're not human. The same idea here. In British museums, we have the remains of more than 10,000 dead people of the non-white races, all called the missing links. And here in the United States, in Washington, the Smithsonian Institute have the remains of about 15,000 individuals of so-called different races. Some museums even had instructions on how you can rob your own graves, how you can pluck up the bullet wounds from freshly killed Aboriginal specimens. Go out there, collect your own species, shoot them, boil down the skulls, pluck up the holes. They teach you how to do that. And missionary accounts in Australia tells us about how Aboriginal men and women and young kids, they were murdered. They had their skulls boiled down and then they sold overseas to collectors. Why? Why does evolution belief teach that? Well, like I say, if you believe that people groups were evolving for long periods of time, then different people groups are going to be evolving at a different pace, meaning that some groups are going to be more evolved than other groups. So let's get back to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote his book. What's the title of his book? The Origin of Species. Well, that's a shortened title that we read today. The full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Of course, in this book, he didn't really talk about human evolution. But in his second book, The Descent of Man, he became extremely racist. And let me quote Charles Darwin from this second book, The Descent of Man. He said this: "The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world." By savage races, he means the non-white races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, meaning the non-white human races, will no doubt be exterminated, and the break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider. For it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even between the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro, the Australian, and the gorilla. So on one side you put the white man, on the other side you put the gorilla, and in between you put what? The baboon, the Negro, and then an Australian there. You see that? That image? This is Charles Darwin. Professor Peter Bower, he's an expert, a professor of Charles Darwin. And he says this: by the time Darwin writes The Descent of Man in 1871, it's pretty clear that Darwin believed that the non-white races do not have the capacity to be elevated properly into civilized human beings. They are mentally and morally at a more limited level. In a sense, they are stuck at an earlier stage in the biological evolution of human species. Charles Darwin. The famous preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones, he said that the origin of species, I suppose, has been more responsible for undermining people's faith and belief in the scriptures and in God's way of salvation than any other books. He's talking about history. So I'm going to take you up from Darwin to this present day. Notice every 20 years or so, the model changes. But during Charles Darwin's time, there was a very staunch defender of Charles Darwin, very well-known evolutionist, Thomas Huxley. He was such a strong defender of Darwin that they gave him a nickname, Darwin's Bulldog. So what did Darwin's Bulldog believe? He said this in his book: "No rational man, cognizant of the fact, believed that the average Negro is the equal, still less superior, of the white man." Friends, in the past, if you're an evolutionist, you are a racist. It goes hand in hand. So if that was Darwin's bulldog, in Germany, now we go forward a little bit. We have the most famous evolutionist at the time in Germany, Ernst Haeckel. So what? And Ernst Haeckel was given the nickname Darwin's Doberman. So what did he say about the different human races? Now it changes again. Now he says that humanity can be divided into 12 species and then subdivided into 36 different races. 12 species, like cats and dogs and things like that. Ernst Haeckel was very much responsible for changing Germany into an evolution-believing country. He was vital to this idea. Stephen Jay Gould, probably the leading evolutionist in the 1970s, a historian as well, he said this about Ernst Haeckel. He said Haeckel's evolutionary racism, his call to the German people for racial purity, right? That sounds like World War II. An unflinching devotion to a just state. His belief that harsh, inexorable laws of evolution rule human civilization and nature alike, conferring upon the favored races the right to dominate others. He said all this contributed to the rise of Nazi Germany. The belief of racial purity and his belief that if you're a higher race, you have the right to oppress those who are younger. Hitler was not a strange abnormality. Hitler was what was going on in Germany because of Haeckel's teaching. You think it's just in Germany? What about here in the United States? Who has heard of the Scopes trial? Anyone? Quite a few of you. And that is here in the United States, debating about whether we should teach evolution in schools, right? But it's really based on the textbook that was teaching evolution. That's the whole idea here. A civic biology. That's a textbook. Let me read the textbook and you hear what they're actually teaching at that time. It says this: at the present time, there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of men, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or the brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indians, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the native of China, Japan, and the Eskimos. And finally, the highest race type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. It is not unfair to ask if the health and vigor of future generation of men and women on the earth might be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums and other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibility of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. He's saying that if you have mixed race marriages, your offspring becomes degenerated. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. A civic biology, 1914. Friends, the evolutionists here in the United States were the ones who were influencing the evolutionists there in Germany. This is in the textbooks here. So now we are in the early 1900s. This is around the time of Otto Benga, right? Let's move forward 5 years, a few more years. Now the whole evolutionary model has changed. Remember how we talked about how many species and how many subgroups? Now they teach this. There are 3 fundamental human types: the white, the yellow, and the black, related respectively to the chimpanzee, the orangutan, and the gorilla. So now they're saying, depending on your skin color, you have a different ape in your past. You know, if you go out there, you tell evolutionists, they say, no, we don't believe we came from the apes. We believe we share a last common ancestor with the apes. So here the apes come out here, and we become the ape-like creatures, the Australopithecines, and then we become the humans. That's what they teach today, right? But back then, they are saying that we actually came from those apes themselves. Evolutionary model changes all the time. 1924, from the book The Mongol in Our Midst. This is what it says. The intermixture of Mongolian blood, that means Chinese-looking blood like me, with Europeans results in the production of idiots and imbeciles who greatly resemble the orangutan, and the Mongolian in physical traits. This special type of imbecile represents a revision to a type which is phylogenetically lower than the white man. That means become less evolved than the white man. There is here implied the inferiority of the yellow race. But the author is at pain to show that his imbecile has small skulls. How can we reconcile this with the fact that the yellow races have skulls as large, if not larger, than the Europeans? So what he's saying here is that if it is true that the Chinese are less, or this intermixture are less evolved, then why is it that these Chinese-looking people, their brains are bigger than the Europeans? Of course, that is not true, because our brain, our intelligence is not just based on your brain size, right? I mean, if you're bigger size, you have a bigger brain on average. Smaller size, you have a smaller brain. That doesn't mean that the bigger brain is more intelligent than the smaller brain, right? I mean, most ladies here, you tend to be smaller than your husbands. Your brains tend to be smaller. Does that mean that you're less intelligent? Of course not. It's really the way that your brain is wired that makes all the difference. But here, you have this idea that because the Chinese has a bigger brain, so the Chinese must be more evolved. Now, you remember at the start of this talk, I had that strange argument with that guy, and he said that the Chinese are more superior to him. Where did he get that idea from? From things like this, evolutionary teaching. But this is bad science. So now by the middle of the 19th century, now they recognize that, there are 4 races. And all those previous models, they're all thrown away. Now we don't come from the apes. We come from the ape-like creatures, the missing links, called the Australopithecines. But they still have the 4 races. And each one, depending on which race you come from a whole different lineage of ape-like creatures. 1966 now. 1965, in this encyclopedia called Early Man, by the Time Life book. Some of you older ones, you might know this encyclopedia. This is the very first time that you have the ape parade image, where on one side you have an ape, on the other side you have the human. Let me read from this series, from the volume called Evolution, 1969, so not very long ago. It says, man is united in one species, but is racially divided into more than 30 subgroups, which are distinct from each other in genetic type, in details of physical appearance. And it says here that the saving of life for reproduction by ever more efficient medical technology results in an increasing accumulation of detrimental mutations. And now it's talking about eugenics now. On eugenics and the pollution of the gene pool. He said, not so easy, however, is the question whether a person who knows he carries a bad gene has the right to have children. He's saying that if you have bad genes, you cannot be allowed to reproduce. Parents scoring low on intelligence tests tend to produce more children than those making high scores. Then this is what they say. What's the remedy? Changes in the structure of taxation. Tax them. And the award of family allowance and educational grant may already have removed some of the factors which have discouraged the more intelligent from having larger families. Mueller, so he's saying that you're providing grants, you're providing medicine so that the sick recover. He calls this a kind of natural selection in reverse. This is in 1969, 1970s. They are still teaching these things in the encyclopedia. And then the 1980s, National Geographic, you have the same ape parade, ape-like on one side, men on the other side, except every single candidate has now changed. But they still say, you Christians, you do not know what you're talking about. And today, if you go to the Smithsonian website, you see the classic ape parade. And friends, that's where we are today. Each time, 20 years, the whole evolutionary model gets thrown down and a new set replaces it. And each time they say, you Christians, you do not know the science. Friends, we have the Word of God that doesn't change. I did my degree in evolutionary biology more than 20 years ago. Every single candidate that I learned in school that they say was our ancestor, every single one today is disputed by their own fellow evolutionists. Every single one. So if you look at American history, you talk about racism, we all know about the Ku Klux Klan, right? So many of you may know the name David Duke. Anyone know the name David Duke? Okay, racist guy. So who is he? Grand Wizard of Ku Klux Klan. His background, he actually grew up with a Christian background. His dad claimed to believe in Christianity. But then his dad tried to reconcile evolution with Christianity. And as Duke began to read more about this, he began to realize something. You cannot reconcile evolution with the Bible. So he began to reject the Bible. And if you talk to him, you ask him for the reasons for why he believed what he believed. It boils down to two things. First of all, he believed in evolution. Second thing, he believed in the great age of the earth. Because like I say, if people groups are going for hundreds or thousands of years, then different people groups are going to be more evolved than other people groups. Stephen Jay Gould, the leading evolutionist from the 1970s, which I mentioned earlier on, said this, and this is important, so listen to this. He said, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, that means before Darwin wrote his book, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. The litany is familiar. Cold, dispassionate, objective, modern science show us that the races can be ranked on a scale of superiority. And it says that if this offends Christian morality, or if this offends a sentimental belief in human unity, so be it. Science must be free to proclaim unpleasant truths. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying that evolution has always been, racism has always been there, but it increased by orders of magnitude after Darwin wrote his book. Second thing, he said that the races can be ranked, one higher than the other. And the final thing he noticed is this: what Christianity teaches about the races contradict what evolution teaches. The famous atheist Richard Dawkins said this: I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science. Of course, he means evolution by that. When it comes to explaining the world. But I am a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. So friends, what would a consistent Darwinian be? And this is where I think this is something I want all of you to really consider. So earlier on, we said that racism was always there, but it increased by orders of magnitude after Darwin wrote his book. You follow with me there? When did Darwin wrote his book? The Origin of Species was written in 1859. This is 26 years after slavery was already abolished in the British Empire. You know, when you go out there in the culture, they say racism, racism. Where do they pin the blame on racism on? What's the cause of racism? They will all say slavery, right? Slavery. But the Origin of Species was written 26 years after slavery was already abolished. One generation. Slavery is already out of the picture. The Descent of Man, where he was extremely racist, he wrote that in 1871. That is 38 years after slavery was already abolished in the British Empire, and 6 years after the 13th Amendment here in the United States. In other words, slavery was long gone before Darwin. But racism increased by orders of magnitude after Darwin wrote his book. Do you know what that means? The justification for racism had very little to do with slavery. The justification for racism was mainly from a belief in evolutionary theory. Friends, that just changes the whole narrative of what we read in our culture today, when they keep saying slavery, slavery, slavery. No, friends. Racism increased by orders of magnitude only after Darwin wrote his book. Slavery was long gone by then. You know, a number of years ago, you know, Black Lives Matter and all that, they used to have a website where you could write names of people who were extremely racist in the past, right? The general, this general, that general, and all that. And what they would do is that they would pull down those statues. You remember that? The cancel culture? They wipe it out from the books. So a friend of mine got very mischievous. He wrote in Charles Darwin. Guess what happened? Nothing. They do not want to remove him. In fact, the only time I know where they kind of erased Charles Darwin was in a museum in the UK. And in this museum, they talk about Charles Darwin, his evolution, his racism, and people wrote in to complain. So what do? They just remove the racist part and they leave the rest there. They just whitewash the past, so to speak. Make it more pleasant than what it is. Friends, I'm not saying you should do that. See, friends, history is not there to make us comfortable, not there to make us happy. History is there for us to learn. And if history makes us uncomfortable, that's a good thing. Then we will learn not to repeat the mistakes of the past. I'm going to mention a list of names. Okay, you're going to tell me what they all share in common. Are you ready? Karl Marx, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Mussolini, Lenin, Francis Galton, Margaret Sanger. What do they all share in common? Communism is one thing there, but another thing is that every single one of them perhaps are responsible for more lives that were lost in the last century, perhaps more than anyone else. And every single one of those 9 names I mentioned to you, every single one of them lists Charles Darwin as one of their favorite authors. Many of them believed that what they were doing was actually a very good thing. They believed they were putting natural selection into action. So Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics, he was actually Charles Darwin's cousin. So what did Charles Darwin himself say? He said this, meaning allowing the weak to breed or to survive diseases, is highly injurious to the race of man. Excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Francis Galton became the founder of the eugenics movement, killing of those who are weak. But it's not just Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. It's like Darwin's family, his family tree itself. In fact, eugenics become very much a Darwin family business. So when his cousin Francis Galton stepped down, his son Leonard replaced him as the chairman of the National Eugenics Society in 1911. And in Cambridge, 3 more of his sons began to be leading members of the eugenics movement there. It was like a family business for him. And now we talk about abortion, we always talk about Margaret Sanger, right? So who was Margaret Sanger? Founder of Planned Parenthood. She was a white supremacist. She placed her clinics in what she will call the black neighborhood. She called that the Negro Project. Why? So that you can reduce the fertility of the so-called blacks, so that they will not reproduce. She believed that what she was doing was a form of applied biology. She thought she was doing a wonderful thing. She was a white supremacist. Let me read to you what she writes. The brains of Australian aborigines were just one step more evolved than the chimpanzee, and just under blacks, Jews, and Italians. Jews. Why did Hitler target the Jews? Because of this. She said the campaign for birth control is practically identical in ideal with the final aims of eugenics. Birth control propaganda is thus the entering wedge for the eugenics educator. Upon this basis only, meaning birth control, may we improve the quality of the race. And she said that the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. Possibly drastic and Spartan methods may be forced upon society if it continues to complacently encourage the chance and chaotic breeding that results from our stupidly cruel sentimentalism. And she said this, our greatest need, first of all, is to cooperate in the formation of a code of sexual ethics based on a thorough biological and psychological understanding of human nature. She said that we all need a new sexual ethics. We need to invent our own sexual ethics. And she said this, if we can summon the bravery to do this, that means to implement birth control, we shall be best serving the true interests of eugenics. Birth control is not just something that appeared out of nowhere. It was really rooted in this idea of eugenics and evolutionary biology. Here in the United States, in the last century, at least 27 states had laws against mixed-race marriages. You had human breeding programs here, forced sterilization of more than 60,000 US citizens, and even euthanasia, all in the name of evolution. Now in Germany, we know what happened during World War II, right? We have a video that actually says that we humans have transgressed the law of natural selection in the last decades, and that's why they want to kill off the Jews, kill off those who are less weak, kill off those who are mentally handicapped. But remember what Margaret Sanger said about creating your own new sexual ethics? That's what they did in Germany. In Germany, they have what you would call a birth house, a Lebensborn house. So what's a Lebensborn house? Well, these are places where people can go there. So if you are of the so-called pure Aryan race, you can go to this place and have extramarital relationships, produce a baby, and the state would raise the baby up for you. The new sexual ethics. In Germany, there were 8,000 children born this way. In Norway, 10,000 children. So who here know the band ABBA? Anyone ABBA? One of the singers, Freda, she was a Lebensborn children. They did not stop there. Soon they went to Poland, they went to Ukraine, and they started kidnapping kids from their parents right before their parents' eyes. 20,000 of them in Ukraine and Poland. And by the way, after the war, the records were lost. Many of these kids could not be returned back to their parents. And then after they take these kids, they would divide these kids into 3 different groups. First, racially, if you're pure, they call that desirable. They'll be raised up by the state and given all kinds of special privileges. Some of the accounts say that these kids, they're given a bath twice a day. Lots of privileges. The second group are the group that is acceptable. And so they'll be raised up by the state, but without all these special rewards. And the final group is the unwanted group. And these people were either killed or these kids were thrown into hard labor in concentration camps. All in the name of evolution. Friends, there are consequences to ideas. Yet when we read in the Bible tells us a very different picture, right? The Bible says God created the world in 6,000 years ago. There was a worldwide flood about 4,300 years ago that reduced all humanity down to Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and his 3 wives, and they went on to repopulate all other people today. And later on, during the Tower of Babel, God confused the languages, and the different people groups spread out all over the world. And depending on the small subset of genetic information that each group have, they reproduce among themselves, and that is how we get the different people groups that we see today. In Acts chapter 17, verse 26, it says this, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth." We are all related. And friends, if Noah, the flood, was just 4,300 years ago, that means that there's no time for some people group to be more evolved than other people group. We are all the same. We are all equal, all made in the image of God, and all sinners, all in need of Christ. Professor Joanna Cruikshank, who is a professor in Australia, she said this, "In the earlier periods, one of the few persistent barriers to social Darwinian theory in Australia was the Christian doctrine that all human beings were of one blood." So you say to me, "Oh, come on, how can we all be of one blood? I'm looking at you and you're yellow skin, right? Of course you're different from me. See, there's yellow, there's black, there's red, there's white." Really? I don't think so. We are all just different shades of the same skin color. Some of you say you're black. Are you really black? No, look yourself, you're dark brown. Different amounts of melanin in your skin. Some of you say you're white. Are you white? No, you're not. This is white. Compare that. You're light brown. And some of you maybe you're a little bit pinkish because you have the blood that's running under your skin. but it's just different shades of melanin that we have. We are all the same. But you say to me, okay, I understand skin color, right? But I look at you and you have a different eye from me. You have the Asian eye. So how do you explain that? Well, the differences are very minute. They're really just skin deep after all. When you look at the Asian eye, why do we have this different eye? Because we actually have this epicantic fold. It's a little fold of skin on the inside of your eye. All right? And most babies in your mom's womb, you have the epicantic fold as well. And as they develop, they lose the epicantic fold, giving you the European-looking eye. Asians, we retain the epicantic fold. We don't lose that. And we have a fat layer under our eye. So that give our eye a very distinct shape. But the differences are just so small. In fact, in Asia, in South Korea, plastic surgery is very popular, right? And some of them, they don't want the Asian eye, they want a more European-looking eye, a bigger eye. They get the plastic surgeon to cut the epicantic fold, and that gives them a more European-looking eye. It's just as simple as that. Now you say, can we group people according to skin color? Well, in a sense, what will happen? If you try to group people according to the skin color we mentioned earlier on, then this is what will happen. You get the Swedish, the French, the Eskimo, the so-called white, you put them in one group. The so-called Oriental-looking Chinese, Japanese, put them one side. Right? You get the South American Indians, you get the Maori from New Zealand, put them one side. And then you have the Australian and the Pygmies, the Bushmen, and put them one side. Right? We can classify them into color. You think that they'll group into color means that they're closely, genetically similar, right? So the dark skin, Papua New Guinea, Australia, Pygmy, the so-called Bushmen, you put them as one group. But it turns out that within this group, they're actually the most diverse genetically from one another. So you cannot just look at the skin color and say, hey, look, we're closely related. It doesn't always work that way. The Bible presents to us a very different picture. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. We all go back to Adam. And at the Tower of Babel, that's where the different people groups spread out. But how then do you explain skin color? We actually know from genetics that if Adam and Eve were a medium brown, we get the right genetic combination, both of them are medium brown, in one generation, just by combining your genetics, you can get from whitest white to darkest dark in one single generation. One of the most popular topics that we have in Creation magazine. So Creation magazine is a magazine that we produce quarterly. There's no advertising in there on purpose. So one of the most popular top articles that has generated a lot of news is this article called the two-tone twins, where we showed parents who are medium brown and they have twins. And one of them is really white colored in your skin and the other one is really dark. But they're siblings. Friends, it's easy to account for the so-called skin color or racial differences. We are all one blood. A number of years ago, you might know that we have the Human Genome Project. And they tried to do a draft of the Human Genome Project. And one of the guys that was very hating this project was Dr. Werner, Dr. Craig Werner. And now he looked at the genetics, and what do you think he declared? He said this: Dr. Werner and scientists at the National Institute of Health recently announced that they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome. And the researchers had unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Friends, you remember what evolutionists have always been saying? Evolution demands racism. You Christians, you do not know your science. You are out of date. Science has caught up with what the Bible has always said. We have the Word of God and we can trust that. Here's another scientist involved in that. He said that the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Friends, there is no such thing as one race being superior to other races. Today, if you go to many evolutionists, they say, no, we are not racist. We believe that all of us are equal. But where do they get the idea from? It's not from evolutionary theory. It's because the genetics demand that they say that today. But that is what the Bible has always been saying from the very first time. We know today from genetics that all humanity came from one man and one woman in the past. All of us, in our cell, we have what we call the mitochondria. That's the power plant, produces the energy for us. The mitochondria has its own DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is only passed down from the mother to its offspring. So we can trace that back, and we know that we came from one woman in the past. Guys, we all have the X and Y chromosome, right? The Y chromosome is only passed down from the father through the male line. And we know that we all came from one man in the past. Exactly like what the Bible says, Adam and Eve. Of course, evolutionists, they will not agree. They say, yes, this mitochondria Eve, that's what they call it, and Y chromosome Adam, they say that goes back all the way hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well, how do they get their idea? This is what they do. First, they assume the evolutionary hundreds of thousands of years. They assume that. And then they look at the differences among all humanity today. And then they work that backwards and say, look, therefore, mitochondria Eve and Y chromosome Adam has to be all the way back in time. But they get that because they already assume the evolutionary timeline. There's a much better method. That is called the pedigree method. So what's that? We can look at the grandfather, look at the son, and look at the grandson, right? We can measure how fast mutations accumulate with each generation. And every generation, we accumulate about 100 more mutations than the previous generation. We can measure this. So the pedigree method allows us to measure that. So we have an accurate date. Now we look at all the diversity in human beings. And guess what we find? Let me read from this secular, non-creation, secular evolutionary paper. It says this. If the high mutation rate seen in human pedigree, which is what we just talked about, were used to calculate the age of our most recent female ancestor, she would live just 6,000 years ago, a date more consistent with biblical Eve than the evolutionary time scale for mitochondria Eve. Friends, welcome back to the Bible. We know as a fact from genetics today that all humans belong to one race. Our DNA, all humanity, we are less than 0.2% different. Again, let me go back to that verse that we keep reading again and again. Acts 17:26. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to inhabit all the face of the earth. We are all people everywhere made in the image of God. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul declares the gospel. But how does he declare the gospel? In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45, it says this, thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. To explain why Jesus Christ had to die a physical death on the cross, he had to go back to explain how physical death came in through the first man, Adam, when he fell into sin. And notice this verse doesn't say first Adam. It says first man, Adam. Adam was not one out of 10,000 hominids that was evolving out of Africa, as evolutionists insist. No, he was a special creation that God created out of the dust of the ground and breathed his breath into him so that he became a living soul, a living being, made in the image of God, different from all the other animals. And then from one of his sides, his rib, God made Eve, again, a supernatural creation. And the reason why Jesus Christ had to die a physical death on the cross was because the first man, Adam, brought physical death into this world. And Christ had to come as a physical being to die on the cross because he's a blood relative to all of us. And he has to die a physical death so that he can be our kinsman redeemer. If we are not all related all the way back to Adam as the Bible teaches 6,000 years ago, friends, then there's no salvation for you. Christ is our kinsman redeemer. So we saw what happened at the beginning. We saw what Christ did at the cross. Let's go to Revelation. And in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, it says this. And they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain and purchased for God with your blood, people from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. Friends, what's the solution to racism? The gospel. The gospel. So let us sum up this talk. I know I mentioned a lot of things. First of all, I took you down through history, right? You saw how evolutionary theory keep changing. Each time they say, you Christians, you do not know. We show that evolutionary theory demands racism. We take you through history. You look at Human Zoo, Ota Benga, Abraham Uricup, and things like that. Then we show you genetics, that chimps, all humanity, we are so similar. Chimpanzee, genetically, they're so different that it cannot have a single, cannot share a common ancestor with us. Maybe I'll talk about this a little while after this. We see that people groups around the world, skin color, eyes, other unique features, they are so minute. The differences are really just skin deep. Then we see the Bible. The Bible has declared from the beginning that there is only one human race. And genetics, science has caught up with the Bible today. The Bible tells us very clearly, because of what Christ did, what Christ will come to do, salvation becomes possible. We are all made in the image of God, all descendants of Adam and Eve. And Jesus Christ came as our kinsman redeemer. And if we believe in him, he's our kinsman redeemer to redeem us to himself, a chosen people for himself, to redeem sinners and to undo the curse that came in through the first man, Adam. Friends, the solution to racism is the gospel. A gospel that's rooted in what the Bible says in Genesis and what Christ did on the cross and what he would come to do. So I would like to sum up this talk here. Well, if you want to know more about these things, you can go to creation.com. We have lots of free resources, over 40 years of research and 10,000 articles. Another one is the Creation magazine that we have here. This is perhaps one of the most popular resources that we have because we have more life, testimonies of life being changed through this one resource than any other resource we have. So if you go into the other room later on, you can see some of the resources we have. Creation magazine is one. And there's no advertising in here on purpose because this is designed for equipping and evangelism. It's a quarterly magazine. So what's inside here? Well, I'll give you one example. An interview that we did. Okay, so who here has heard of the claim that chimpanzees and humans, we are 98.5% similar? Anybody? 2% similar? Where do we get that numbers from? Ever wondered? The number comes from the 1970s by this guy called Dr. John Elquist. He was a bird expert. And that was based on using a technique that nobody uses today because it's kind of like primitive. And he came up with this idea that all humanity, that chimps and humans, we are less than 2% different. 2% difference, our DNA, 3 billion base pairs, 3 billion letters long. 2% of that is still 60 million letters different. According to evolution, humans and chimps are only maybe the last common ancestor 3 to 7 million years ago. 60 million differences. Evolution don't have enough time to account for that at all. The guy who came up with that 2%, John Elquist, he looked at the data, he realized that's too big for evolution to account for. He went back, looked at the information, and guess what? He became a creationist. And he was involved with creation research until he passed away in 2020. I used to exchange long emails with him about this very issue. And when he died, he did not hold to that 98.5% similar. He said that our DNA with chimps is probably closer to 85 to 90% similar. If 2% difference is impossible for evolution, 15% difference, there's no common ancestry there. And do you remember I mentioned the Y chromosome? That's something that all guys we have. If you compare the chimpanzee Y chromosome and the human Y chromosome, half of them is missing. You can't even compare it. The other half that is similar enough to compare is only 70% similar. Friends, genetics tell us there's no common ancestry between chimps and humans. And in contrast to that, all humanity were less than 0.2% different. John Elquist became a creationist. He became a Christian. The next time you hear somebody coming up to you, chimps and humans are 98% similar, tell them, do you know where you get it from? He got it from this guy called John Elquist, and he became a creationist. So if you're interested in Creation Magazine, it's a subscription, 1-year subscription. You get the first issue here today. It's a quarterly magazine. We mail the rest to you. And we also send you emails, monthly periodicals in between those months to give you updates, because this is a quarterly magazine. And then we throw in a free digital version that used to be $10. And with a digital version of the magazine, you can use that, share it with your friends, send it to your grandparents, send it to your kids. Use that as a stepping stone to reach out to them. And when you're done with that magazine, don't leave it at home. Give it to a friend. Use it for street evangelism. Leave it at the doctor's office. Make a difference, because that is what it was designed to do. And that's for a 1-year subscription. You get the first issue here today and get the free digital version. We'll mail the rest to you. For 2 years, you get those things I mentioned earlier on, but we're also going to throw in 2 DVDs. So this one used to be a $15 DVD. It is Darwin's trip to Galapagos Islands. And we asked this question: if Charles Darwin was alive today, would the science support his idea of evolution or creation? We address things like natural selection, mutation, speciation, and so on. The other one is, why does a good God allow bad things? So very popular talk as well. So that's for a 2-year subscription. Again, it's on the other room. If you're interested in it, by the way, do all of you have this form? If you have this form, fill in that form and bring it to the book tables. If you don't have it, you can go to the other room and pick up a form and fill it in for yourself as well. Another book that I highly recommend is this book called The Creation Answers Book, the top 60 questions in 20 chapters. So what's in there? What about dinosaurs? That's 1 chapter. Where did the different races come from? That's chapter 18. How did the animals get to Australia? Ever wonder about that? Where did Cain get his wife? What about carbon dating? What about gap theory? They got really created in 6 days. What about continental drift? What about the Ice Age? What about carbon dating? All answered in this one book alone. Here's another one. I'm a bit biased here because I'm a co-author of this book. So that's, of course, my favorite book on dinosaurs. And this is actually our most comprehensive book on dinosaurs. It's for high school and above. But if you know somebody who really loves dinosaurs, then this is the one I'll recommend. Have you ever wondered, are there feathered dinosaurs? We address that in 2 chapters. How did dinosaurs die out extinction? We address that in there as well. And this is another one by my co-worker, Dr. Robert Carter, fresh off the press. It's called Biblical Biology 101. Highly recommend this book as well. By the way, remember I talked about Creation Magazine? Dr. Carter was an evolutionist, and through Creation Magazine, he became a creationist. It's not hard. We can make a difference. These things are easy if you train yourself to make this information easy to understand. Here's another one, Dismantled. This is talking about the human apes, the ape-like people, right? The Australopithecines, Neanderthals, and things like that. If you have questions about that, highly recommend this DVD called Dismantled. So friends, we have lots of interesting resources, but as I mentioned earlier on, check out Creation Magazine first, and I'll be in the other room to answer any questions that you may have as well. So I'd like to end all of my talks with a Bible verse. We saw what happened at the beginning, we saw what Christ did at the cross. Now we go to Revelation. And they sang a new song saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seal. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Friends, the ultimate goal of all things is the glory of God. And thank you.